Happy New Year. Thank you for tuning in this morning. We're delighted to have you on a beautiful Hilton Head Island in Bluffton in South Carolina day. You might have seen this morning in the news where the FAA has put a ground stop on all flights until 10 a.m. this morning due to computer problems. And I also found it very interesting. I'm one of those people who likes to know what happened this day in history. And as I was looking back prior to this morning, I saw that in 1935, Amelia Earhart flew solo from Hawaii to California. And all these years later, we're still flying, but some computer glitches this morning. In the new year, I'm pleased to announce also that Tom Hens has joined our team. Tom comes to us from a stellar career in banking. He's got going to have a strong emphasis on working with our small businesses, assisting them as well as leading them. And then from a policy side, he's going to work for the betterment of our community, the betterment for our residents, as well as for our businesses. And he'll do that not only on a local level, but a state level and a national level too, working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We have a timely lineup of guests for you on this first show of the new year. And here to talk about what just happened in the House of Representatives in Washington. We'll also see where our economy is headed and what Hilton Head Island's new mayor's priorities will be for 2023. You know, last week we watched as the Speaker of the House, how that all unfolded, and it hasn't happened that way in over 100 years. And Neil Bradley offers some very interesting insight. Neil, he served as the Chief of Staff for Congressman Kevin McCarthy during his 20 years of working on Capitol Hill. And he's one of the most influential people in Washington, working on behalf of business each and every day. He currently serves as Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer for the United States Chamber of Commerce. And he's also a frequent contributor on CNN, Fox, and many other media outlets. But I want to tell you, most of all, Neil's a great guy and a good friend. Neil Bradley, thanks for joining us this morning. We're delighted to have you.
Well, Bill, thank you, and right back at you. You and the Hilton Head Chamber are phenomenal partners to us. You're a good friend to me personally. I have but one regret, and you know this, and that is my wife and I don't get down to Hilton Head nearly as often as we used to pre-kids. But he's getting older, and that'll have to change soon. As you noted, Bill, pretty historic week last week. We finally elected a Speaker of the House on the 15th ballot at about 2 in the morning, Friday into Saturday morning. We hadn't had multiple ballots for Speaker in 100 years. We hadn't had more than a dozen ballots for Speaker since before the Civil War. So in that context, it truly is historic. But in other contexts, it's kind of the new normal. If you think about our election cycles, they reflect the fact that we are a pretty deeply but pretty evenly divided country. 10 of the last 12 elections, that's 10 of the last 12 elections since 2000 have produced a change in control in either the House, the Senate, or the White House. So we're living in a period in which majorities and presidencies kind of flip back and forth between the parties. The 2022 election was no exception to that. We went from a 50-50 Senate to a 51-49 Democratic majority, one seat. In the House, we went from a 222 to 213 Democrat to Republican majority to a 222 to 213 Republican to Democratic majority. So literally just a mirror image of what we were after the 2020 election. Interestingly, while all the focus was on the number of votes that now Speaker McCarthy got, at the end of the day, he got 216 votes to become Speaker. The last time Nancy Pelosi was up, she got 216 votes to become Speaker. When John Boehner, the predecessor to Speaker Pelosi, the last Republican Speaker before Paul Ryan, he won with 216 votes. So in some ways, there's more public drama around it, but the outcome and these close votes kind of reflect where we are as a nation. What does this mean kind of going forward? And let me share in areas of concern, areas of opportunity as we see it, and then just a little bit of kind of mission, I think, for the business and chamber community. And in terms of areas of concern, I think it really is on the fiscal side. There's no question that our runaway debt and deficit, we have to do something to bring those under control. I think the concern is that to get anything done in divided government, you're going to have to get Republicans and Democrats on the same page. So there's no way to make law over the next 2 years without getting to bipartisan agreement, getting Republicans in the House and Democrats in the Senate, and obviously President Biden's signature. And when we look at some of the commitments that were made on the fiscal side to cut spending back to FY22 levels, which means if you're going to hold defense harmless, you got to come up with an extra $75 billion on top. And if you hold veterans harmless, you got to come up with even more money to do that. If you look at the commitments on how appropriations bills are going to work and then the debt limit, we are looking at an increased chance of another government shutdown. We haven't had one in about 5 years, but the last one was pretty problematic for businesses, people who were waiting on permits and processing from federal agencies who literally had a month where they couldn't get anything done. So that's an increased risk today. Perhaps the biggest risk, of course, is the debt limit. The U.S. has never defaulted on its debt. If you go back to our founding, kind of the miracle of Alexander Hamilton and the founders was this concept of the full faith and credit of the United States government. It's the reason that we have interest rates as low as they are. It's the reason why the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. All of those things inure to the benefit of the American business community and the American people. Those begin to be questioned if we were to ever default on our debt. Interest rates absolutely go up. That means mortgage rates go higher than they are even today. That loans for businesses and individuals, interest rates go up on that. It means turmoil for businesses who operate globally and have concerns about trade values and exchange rates and what this means for their profits. So it's hard to overstate the importance of making sure that we don't fall ourselves into a default, and it'll be a big focus of ours at the chamber. If those are areas of concern, there are also areas of opportunity. And two of the big ones that we're going to be focused on at the chamber, the first is permitting reform. Thanks to your and others' help, we finally got a major infrastructure package enacted. The biggest hurdle now isn't the funding to do projects. The biggest hurdle now is navigating a really complicated permitting process so that we can actually start projects. At the end of last year, we had competing proposals in the Senate, one from Republicans and one from Democrats, on how to reform the permitting process. The interesting thing is that those two proposals had more in common than they had different. And we think that there's an opportunity this year to bridge the differences between the two parties and get some permitting reform enacted that will allow a lot of the projects that we now have funded to actually occur on a timely basis. The second, this may surprise some people, but actually is doing something about the southern border and legal immigration reform. We've been at this kind of stalemate for years between efforts to secure the border and necessary updates to our legal immigration system. And neither side, proponents on either side, wanted to give up anything to the other to kind of advance the ball. There seems to be the settling in of this notion that that's no longer acceptable, that the one thing that everyone agrees we can't do is nothing, that we can't keep the status quo for another 2 years. And perhaps the most dramatic example of why I have hope for immigration and border security is what's going on actually over the last several days at the southern border. It actually wasn't President Biden's trip. It was a trip of bipartisan senators, Tom Tillis, Kristen Sinema, John Cornyn, Chris Murphy on the Democratic side, all of whom went down there together for the purpose of saying, if all of us are going to get anything done, we're going to have to compromise. And it's building off some quiet negotiations that with the U.S. Chamber support took place at the end of last year to address things like ag workers and H-1B workers and H-2B and seasonal workers, and at the same time put more resources into the border, more requirements around E-Verify to make sure that people aren't coming into the country and working illegally. And so we actually see some pathways here to get something done. There'll also be other areas where we'll get bipartisan agreement. The great misnomer is that divided government absolutely means gridlock. It actually doesn't. We've been able to find bipartisan solutions in governments that look just like this one. Republican House, Democratic Senate, Democratic White House. In fact, the last major reforms that we got to SEC regulations and access to capital for emerging new and growth businesses was done in those 2 years after Republicans took the majority in the Obama midterm. So we have a list of things that we think we can get done. Finally, let me just leave you with this, and this is a kind of a mission for all of us here. And that is, there are a lot of new members of Congress. Startling fact, in 2017, we finally enacted long overdue tax reform to benefit families, corporations, and small businesses. At the time, there were 24 Republicans on the House Ways and Means Committee who put that together. It's only 5 years later, I guess 6 years later, 5.5 years later, the number of members who are still around out of that 24 today is 5. So that tells you something about some of the turnover that's occurred in Washington and some of the work that we have to do educating lawmakers about pro-growth, pro-business policies. So with that, Bill, I'll turn it back over to you and happy to take any questions.
Neil, thank you. And that number 216, that was certainly very interesting to hear that. I did not know that. We've got a couple questions for you, and the first one is coming from Mary, and Mary is asking, was there anything related to term limits put forth by those negotiating votes for the speaker?
There is a commitment that the House will vote on a term limits proposal. It's been maybe almost 20 years since the House has voted on term limits. Obviously, that has to be done via constitutional amendment, so that it will take a 2/3 vote. We don't see much opportunity for it getting 2/3 in the House. So they will have a debate, they will have a vote. I think that's important, but I don't think it's going to pass.
All right, thank you. A question for Mark. He's asking, how difficult will it be for Speaker McCarthy if a single member of Congress is now allowed to start the vote all over again?
Yeah, it's certainly something that hangs out there. I mean, to be fair, this is not a new rule. It existed from 1910 all the way until Speaker Pelosi changed it during about 4 years ago. It had actually never been used during that period. It was threatened to be used against Speaker Boehner and ultimately led to his resignation. So I do think it is an area of concern. Obviously, one member can make the motion, but you still have to get a majority, 218. I think the thing that concerns us is making sure that members don't try to use that tactic as a way of stalling other important business. So, we've articulated our concern, for example, that we need to do a government funding bill to keep the government from shutting down. There happens to be a small number of members who don't like it, and they use this motion as frankly, a dilatory tactic to prevent Congress from prevent the House from taking up that funding bill. And so I think that's the real area of concern more than anything else.
Thank you. Next question is coming from Robert, and Robert says, do you think Congress will work to make changes to the recent growth of the IRS?
They voted Monday night in the House to rescind the money that was provided to the IRS in the Inflation Reduction Act. That passed on a party line vote, but Senator Schumer and the Senate leadership have already made clear they're not even going to take that up for a vote. So I think this is kind of the end of the line. It's going to be a debate. The House is going to approve it. The Senate's not going to rescinding the money. The Senate's not going to approve rescinding the money, and therefore not much is going to change.
Okay, one last question for you coming from Ted. And Ted is asking, do you feel with a Republican House and Democratic Senate, will we see more compromise and working across the aisle?
Well, we have to. If anything's going to get done, it takes compromise and working across the aisle. We have a phrase we're using here at the U.S. Chamber. Gridlock's a choice. And so we don't have to live in gridlock. If elected lawmakers choose gridlock, then that's what we get. But if they choose working across the aisle, finding areas of common agreement, there's actually a whole lot of things that they can get done. So we view part of our job as kind of pushing on them to make sure that they choose progress rather than gridlock. Because if they choose gridlock, we're going to be sitting here for the next 2 years. And by the way, to end where I began, 10 of the last 12 elections have resulted in a change in control. This isn't going away anytime soon. If we can't figure out how to get both sides working together to find some level of common ground, then the outcome of after the next election is likely to be more gridlock too, and we just can't afford that as a nation.
Neil, thank you very much for your time. I can see coming in the very near future, #gridlock's a choice.
Gridlock's a choice. That's exactly right. Thank you, Bill, and great to see everyone this morning.
Always great to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Bye-bye.
All right. And then also, I'd like to tell you, if you'd like to take a deeper dive, I've asked Kelly to put in the chat box one of Neil's colleagues, a U.S. Chamber of Commerce staffer, who formerly served as the parliamentarian in the House. And he does a really very good job of explaining why the vote took place, how it took place, and some of the history behind the vote. So I'd encourage you to, if you have a chance this afternoon or later on this week, to tune in and click on that and see what he has to say. All right, so now we know that in 2022, we've talked about the economy. We're talking about it in 2023, what type of challenges we may have and what's ahead of us. And to find out just how that will impact South Carolina, we're really glad to have with us again South Carolina's research economist, Dr. Joy Van Nessen from USC's Darla Moore School of Business. And I'll tell you, Dr. Van Nessen is highly regarded for his expertise in addition to his work on behalf of the state of South Carolina with the University of South Carolina. He's also done economic research and consulting for, I don't know, a couple small companies you might have heard, somebody like maybe Boeing or Michelin. Dr. Van Nessen, welcome, and tell us what we expect to see in 2023.
Well, good morning, Bill, and thank you very much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to participate this morning. It's great to see everybody, and Happy New Year to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I know we just have a few minutes this morning, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Really, when we look at 2023 with respect to both the state's economy and for the nation's economy, the big question on everyone's mind is whether we're destined for recession this year. That is the concern. And we've seen some slowdowns across the board throughout 2022. And so given the persistent high inflation and the rate increases coming from the Fed that we've experienced, are we going to see a recession in 2023? I do have concerns over the possibility of a mild recession this year that I will address. But before we do that, I first want to put into context where the state's economy stands currently in January of 2023. Because even though we do have concerns about a potential recession this year, the reality is that right now, South Carolina's economy overall is still in very good shape. We have seen very strong employment growth throughout most industry sectors over the last 2 years, including in 2022. And as of this past summer, the state as a whole has now surpassed its pre-pandemic employment levels, meaning that for South Carolina as a whole, we've recovered all the jobs that we lost during the 2020 recession. So remember, during that 60-day period between February and April of 2020, South Carolina actually lost about 15% of its employment base, about 308,000 jobs. And all of those jobs now have been recovered. And today, where we are in January of 2023, we're at employment levels that are about 3% higher than where we were back in February of 2020 before the COVID recession began. Meaning that we have more people working today in South Carolina than at any time in our history. And this recovery and great job growth that we've seen extends across most regions in South Carolina. Areas that have seen the most job growth over the past 2 years have been Charleston, Myrtle Beach, and Greenville-Spartanburg. All three areas have seen have employment levels today in excess of 5% compared to where they were before the pandemic recession in February of 2020. Hilton Head, Beaufort County, also has recovered all the jobs that it lost as well, although it hasn't seen growth that's quite been as strong as in Charleston, Myrtle Beach, and in Greenville and Spartanburg. And the reason is that if we look across the board industry-wise, we find that most of the recovery, or at least a bulk of the recovery, has come from manufacturing and come from the housing industry, and more generally come from the durable goods sector. That's what's really driven this recovery nationwide and what's been driving the recovery in South Carolina. And those three areas all have high concentrations of manufacturing and have seen benefits from housing recovery as well. And so this durable goods bubble really emerged over the past 2 years, again, driving growth that we have seen and the great recovery that we've been experiencing. And that's largely been the result of a change in consumer preferences. That normally when we think about where consumers are spending money, it's both on goods and on services. And throughout 2020 and 2021, we saw the pendulum swing away from the services sector and towards the goods sector, and durable goods in particular, primarily because consumers were staying home. Everybody was worried about getting sick, particularly before the vaccine was widely available. Worried about going out. And so they were making home renovations. In many respects, they were adding to their home, looking for a way to add a home office because they were working at home and remote work was becoming more of a norm. Buying vehicles, fitness equipment, furniture, all of those things at the expense of going on vacation or going out to eat. So we saw a significant pendulum swing in the direction of goods and away from services. And then in 2022, we began to see the reverse happen. The pendulum began to swing back. We saw less spending on durable goods, more spending on the services sector. So even though manufacturing and housing really drove growth in 2020 and 2021, in 2022, it was the services sector that led the way, and leisure and hospitality. And that happened throughout South Carolina as we've seen consumer preferences move back towards their pre-pandemic norms. So all in all, we've seen very strong employment growth and a very strong economy in South Carolina. And so that begs the question of why doesn't it feel like the economy is doing well? We know that for many people it doesn't. Consumer confidence levels are actually at their lowest levels right now, going all the way back to 2008 when we were in the depths of the Great Recession. So for many, it doesn't feel like the economy is doing well, despite the fact that we have a lot of positive metrics that we can observe. And the reason for that is actually very simple. It's inflation. Inflation, as we all know, is at a 40-year high and has been throughout most of 2022 and continues to be the single biggest threat for South Carolina's economy as we go into 2023 because it reduces the buying power of the consumer. And consumer spending represents the largest percentage of GDP, the largest percentage of our economy. About 70% of GDP comes from consumer spending. And this high inflation has already had very practical implications for South Carolinians. When we just do a straight comparison between wage growth for South Carolina workers and the inflation rate, we find that inflation has exceeded wage growth in South Carolina by about 5 percentage points over the last 2 years and by about 3 percentage points in the last 12 months. So from a practical perspective, that just means that the average South Carolinian has been consistently losing purchasing power over the past year and over the past 2 years. So that continues to be a problem. And so why has inflation been so high in 2022? It begs the question of what the cause here and what's the cause? And it's essentially been because we've seen a significant supply and demand imbalance emerge since the COVID recession in 2020, in which demand has been far outpacing supply. Demand has been far outpacing supply overall. And the cause of that imbalance, we can attribute that to the high levels of stimulus activity that occurred in 2020 and 2021. And the way I like to describe it is to use an analogy that basically the US economy drank two Red Bulls in the form of two federal stimulus packages, one in 2020 and one in 2021, $6 trillion worth. And we've been on the equivalent of a caffeine high ever since in the form of a major spike in consumer demand. And one of the side effects has been the high inflation that we've seen throughout the last year. And since 2020, we've seen the average US household benefit considerably, both from that stimulus, those stimulus dollars, as well as from the rapidly recovering labor market. So if you think about the average household, they have been able to go back to work and are earning wages. And they're also benefiting from the stimulus checks that were issued as a result of the stimulus package. They've also benefited from a variety of tax credits, long-term deferment of student loan repayments, in some cases, enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, particularly in 2020 and early 2021. So when you put all this together, a rapidly recovering labor market plus all of these stimulus dollars, you get a situation where consumers and American households are in very good financial shape. And in fact, the average checking account balance for American households right now is still about 10% higher than where it was back in 2019. And so what that means is that consumers have had these financial reserves to be able to continue to spend, even though inflation has been high. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen a strong economy persist throughout 2022. Consumer spending has been very stable, despite the fact that we've seen a 40-year high in inflation, that many households still have these financial reserves that they're able to draw on. But that is a temporary factor. And as we go into 2023, that's going to be an important metric to continue to watch. Because 2023 is likely to be, as we look at a long run outlook and really what's the dominant theme for this year, I think it's likely to be a theme of recalibration or readjustment, where we do come off of this caffeine high and move back closer to pre-pandemic norms that are more consistent with long run growth rates. The Federal Reserve is taking a leading role in this recalibration through raising interest rates. And we've already seen the effects of these higher interest rates in the housing market that we're all familiar with. That's typically the first sector to be impacted by rising rates. And I mentioned before that housing has been one of the principal drivers for the state's economy in 2020 and 21, but in fact was the only industry that actually saw a decline in employment levels in 2022. So if you look across all sectors in South Carolina's economy over the last year, housing is the only one that saw negative employment growth. Again, why is that the case? It's because of rising interest rates, this readjustment back to pre-pandemic norms. Mortgage rates have gone up. That's made the cost of buying a home higher. And the total reduction in sales activity in South Carolina has been about 23% over the past 12 months. But again, that reflects a recalibration to sales levels that are more consistent with what we were seeing before the pandemic began back in 2019 and early 2020. So readjustment is really the theme. This is not 2008. This is not a period where we're looking at a major economic pullback, but it is a period where we go back to what I mentioned before about this durable goods bubble. We are readjusting to levels of demand that are more consistent with what we saw before the pandemic and which are more likely to be sustainable long run. What we've seen, particularly in the housing industry over the past 2 years, is something that is clearly not sustainable as we move forward. So in 2023, it's likely that we'll continue to see a broader pullback as interest rates continue to rise. A recession is certainly not inevitable this year, but it will primarily depend on how quickly inflation subsides. So in wrapping up, I would invite you to think about a comparison to keep your eye on and really a race between inflation and household savings. So I mentioned before that households are still in pretty good financial shape, but of course that's temporary as high rates of inflation are eating into those excess financial reserves. And so you can think about inflation coming down in 2023 and also those excess financial reserves coming down as well. which one comes down first? Can we get inflation down before back to normal levels before consumers eat away at all of their excess financial reserves? If the answer is yes, then we are far less likely to see a recession this year. If inflation remains high, however, and consumers do exhaust those resources, then we're going to see more of a pullback in consumer spending, and that's likely to lead to an uptick in unemployment over time, and perhaps the onset of a mild recession. So to sum up, I would suggest that race in this year of recalibration is really what we need to be focused on. How quickly does inflation come down, and how does that pair with the excess financial reserves that American households still have in terms of how it relates to what we may see with consumer spending in 2023. So a lot of information there. I'll go ahead and stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions that anyone has. And thank you again for inviting me this morning.
All right, Dr. Von Nessen, thank you so much. Very, very informative as always. And we do have a few questions for you. The first one is coming from Susan. And Susan is asking, we have job recovery, but workforce is still an issue. How do you see that changing in 2023?
Well, we have a very significant labor shortage in South Carolina and throughout the U.S. And the short answer is we don't see that improving in 2023 and really in the next several years. The labor shortage that we're currently seeing is largely the result of the baby boomers who have retired in large numbers over the past 2 years. And that demographic shift is likely permanent. So more than half of the reduction in the labor force that we've seen, more than half of the labor shortage that we're currently experiencing is a result of those baby boomers who have retired. So I think the message to the business community is that this labor shortage is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. So it's something that employers are going to have to get creative with in terms of how to address that, whether that's raising wages or looking at other incentives to attract and retain employees, changing business hours or business practices, and in ways that can accommodate this labor shortage. And in many cases, it's going to involve the adoption of more technology to be able to produce more with fewer workers. So I think that's the biggest piece of the story there. And the way to really think about this, or one way to think about it, is to consider the fact that baby boomers in general turned 65 roughly from the years 2010 to 2030. And so what we would like to have seen is for them to retire at a slow and steady pace over that 20-year period. But what actually happened was that in 2008, because of the Great Recession and the stock market pullback, most baby boomers had to continue to work for several more years because they lost much of what was in their 401ks. So we didn't see as many retirements in 2010, 11, 12, and 13. And then you fast forward to 2020, and then baby boomers there were highly incentivized to retire because they were worried about getting sick. And the stock market was doing extraordinarily well, particularly up through 2021. So rather than a smooth and steady retirement phase over 20 years, it was all squeezed into a very short time period. And we're basically experiencing that market disruption right now.
All right, thank you for that. Mike is asking if the supply chain still having an impact on our economy?
It is. We've seen in many sectors the supply chain issues that have begun to be resolved. We don't see businesses reporting as many disruptions, particularly in the second half of 2022. And that was apparent during the Christmas season, where inventory levels were much higher, certainly compared to what they look like in 2021. So we're definitely moving in the right direction there. I don't think we're going to see a full or even close to a full resolution before the end of this year, the end of 2023. And that's mainly because there are two factors at play. Number one, we're seeing some pullback in demand overall, which we talked about, which I think will continue this year. And of course, shortages are alleviated when demand falls. But the biggest factor is that it just takes time to scale up production to accommodate these broader increases in demand in specific sectors. And so now that we're getting 1.5 to 2 years in to this challenge, that is enough time for many businesses to build these new resources that they need. So when you put those two together, higher supply and a pullback in demand in 2023 suggests that many of these constraints will be resolved by later this year.
You know, our economy is based around tourism here locally, and during the pandemic and last year, we fared very, very well. And you mentioned, you talk about recalibration and readjustment and demand. What do you see, what could the negative effects be if we as a destination were to take our foot off the gas, rest on our laurels, and think that we're going to continue to see that same demand that we've experienced in the last 2 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the short run, we are likely to see some bumps in the road. So it's likely that we'll see some pullback this year. Tourism has done very well, and in a sense, tourism is in a good position because the industry has the wind at its back, because we are still seeing a ramp up as consumers move, that pendulum swings back towards services and away from goods. So that's a very positive sentiment that consumers have for 2023, and that is going to provide some momentum to tourism overall. But if we look more long run over the next decade, I am very bullish about South Carolina and about tourism more generally, because we are looking, South Carolina is right in the middle of the southeastern United States, which is poised for some of the highest growth rates in the country over the next 2 decades, largely because we expect to see more people moving to this region. South Carolina is a very attractive tourist destination. It's also very attractive for the population more generally, looking to retire, looking to move for job opportunities. And the Southeast will see more population gains over the next 2 decades than any other region of the country, based on current migration patterns. So I'm very bullish about the long run of the area and of South Carolina as a whole, even if we do see some a bit of a pullback in demand in the short run as we recalibrate in 2023. But again, having said that, I think tourism and the service sector is in a better position than most, simply because consumer preferences are changing in its favor.
Dr. Von Nessen, it's always great to see you. It's even better to hear you and the knowledge that you share with us. And we appreciate you being with our group today, and look forward to talking with you again sometime here in the new year.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take things now to the local level, and we're going to talk to Hilton Head Island's newly elected mayor, Alan Perry. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Alan, he grew up on Hilton Head Island, and he and his family have been very, very involved over the years, and really truly a part of the fabric of our community. His family was instrumental in launching the Island Recreation Association probably close to 40 years ago, as well as being involved in the most recent multi-million-dollar expansion. You've undoubtedly seen Alan for many, many years volunteering at the St. Patrick's Day Parade. You've probably heard him announcing at the RBC Heritage. You might have seen him volunteering for other events the Rec Center does, and so much more. So Alan, we're glad to have you with us this morning. Congratulations on being elected as Hilton Head Island's mayor, and love to hear what the first few weeks have looked like, and then maybe a couple of your priorities as you move forward in 2023.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that introduction. And first of all, before I get going, I want to congratulate Tom Hens for joining the team there. I've had the pleasure of working with Tom in the past at the bank, and what a great individual he is, and what a great addition to the Chamber of Commerce and for our community. You asked about the past couple of weeks, and it's been drinking from a fire hose. It's been learning lots and getting my schedule set and making certain that I'm not missing anything. Going forward, some of the priorities that we're looking at is really making certain that we're honoring what the previous council has done with their initiatives, mainly with housing. So we're going to be seeing more of that come around in the next couple of weeks, and hopefully we'll have some good announcements coming in the next couple of months. But there are good things that are in progress right now with housing. We know that's one of the main things that we need to address. Also, one of the things that previous council had worked on was redevelopment of our parks. So we're going to go into a workshop here in the next week or so and talk about our Chaplain Park, Crossings Park, in the different parks that we have, to have those redeveloped, to bring them up to standards as to what we need. It's time to take a look at them wholeheartedly and bring them to a current standard. So that we'll be working on. Some of the main things that we want to focus on this year, that I want to focus on, is community trust and respect and decorum, and have a transparency so that the community knows what we're doing. And one of the ways that we're going to do that, which we've already started, is we've gone away from 2 council meetings a month to a workshop, which we had last week, and then a council meeting. This gives us the opportunity to have more conversations with the public about what we're looking to do and how we're going to address the different items that need to be addressed within our community. And we've got to focus on redevelopment. So and the LMO, the land management ordinance. So having these workshops will bring a sense of understanding as to what we're thinking as a council, what the community thinks about what we're talking about, and how we can improve upon our character as a community. And that, we hope, will really bring not only more transparency and clarity to the conversation, but improve the timeline for getting things done. That way, when we come out of a workshop and we go to a council meeting or into a committee, the committee knows what council's thinking, what the community's thinking, and they may have gotten more ideas from those meetings to bring out of committee, so that we don't go back and forth, and we can really push some things forward and get things done. COVID interrupted a lot of things that were happening on the island in the past 4 years for the previous council. And now is the time to address those things that have been put behind and move it forward. By the end of this year, we really want to be in a position where we can check a lot of things off the list, whether it be the parks, whether it be housing, whether it be a number of things. We've got to start looking forward. What we're doing now is we're being reactive. So it's time to be proactive. And we hope that by year end, we'll have checked enough things off the list that we can become more proactive and start looking towards what we need to do. How we're going to address resiliency, how we're going to address stormwater, how we're going to address different things that may come around, have those plans in place so that we're not being very reactive. We know what we're going to do and how we'll handle things. Some other things that we're going to work on besides the LMO rewrite and the parks is the Community Development Corporation for the Gullah area. That is in place. We are now looking for board members. So I encourage anybody and everybody that is interested to be a part of that group to go to the town website to sign up, to see if you can get on that board. It's going to be a great endeavor for our community. It's going to really help out the North End and the Stony Tract. It's going to be a great experience for us. And we've got roughly $5 million that has been allocated by Tom Davis through his efforts with the state. And that's going to drive a real redevelopment in that Stony area. So I encourage you to go to the town website and apply for those committee seats. Let's see, there really right now isn't much other things that we're going to be looking at besides the stuff that comes around day to day. We're working with residents on some developments that are coming around to make certain that we're addressing the LMO to, in the future, prevent clear cutting, making certain that new developments are built within the character of Hilton Head Island, and protect what we have. It's really about our environment and our ecology and ecosystems and everything else that we've got to make certain that are in place.
Mayor, thank you. And Jana is asking, what are your thoughts on the Mid-Island tract?
Yeah, so the Mid-Island tract, while it's been approved by previous council in conceptual plans only, we're going to have to go into workshops and really take a look at that to see what the elements need to be. I look at a conceptual plan, I look at the cost that's been put out there with this conceptual plan, and I think it's a little burdensome. So there's got to be a little more understanding as to what it is that we need, what the costs are to maintain that, where the funding comes from, not only to build it, to maintain it. So we're going to take a look at that holistically and make certain that it fits the character of the island.
Mayor, in town hall now, most of the meetings are streamed. You can see them streaming live, which I think helps tremendously with transparency. And also, I think it's one that allows working people who are in their office to be able to have those meetings on, to be able to watch those meetings, and I guess probably multitasking. So from your standpoint, how important is it for those to continue being streamed and the public having that access?
Well, I will speak from my standpoint. Over the past couple of years, I have been streaming the meetings in the background and listening for since they came around. I think it's of the utmost importance to have that and to continue that. Obviously, if somebody wants to have a say, they've got a chance to send in a written comment or go in person, but having the streaming, access is key. And being able to understand and hear what's going on within your community is so important.
Thank you, Mayor. And Sam is asking about the Caligny Beach Park, the area, and it's so day trippers seem to use that a lot, and to see what type of improvements or parking ideas you might have for that area.
Sure. So there has been a group that's been pulled in by the town to address and study the parking within not only Caligny, but everywhere that the town has parking spots on the island for beach parking. So technology will have a play in this, mobile apps. So we'll be able to determine what spaces are open. So if somebody is looking to come into the island from off, anywhere from Beaufort to Bluffton, Okatee, Pool, or wherever, they can pull up an app and say, it seems like there's a lot of traffic on the island today. There's not many parking spots open. So hopefully that will help ease some of that congestion that we have, but also give the information to the day trippers so they understand what they're facing if they're trying to come here. So this is a program that is going to be addressed, I believe, in the next 2 months as well. So look forward to getting that out there.
The last council dealt with the pandemic and fought through that really, really hard and really, really well. The new council comes into office with probably town revenues at the highest that they've ever been. And I just want to mention that we look forward to working with you, the new council, standing side by side and making sure that Hilton Head Island continues to remain strong, and the health and economic well-being continues to be those that we can keep people in jobs full-time year-round and make great changes that need to be made for our community and for our residents. And I know you'll lead the way in that and doing a terrific job.
Absolutely.
Mayor, thank you for being with us. We look forward, whether we're sitting in town hall or watching it stream, to continue to watch council meetings and planning meetings and other things that are going on. But congratulations again. We look forward to working with you and the new council.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And Happy New Year to all.
Thank you. All right, this coming Monday will be Dr. Martin Luther King holiday, and I want to remind everyone of the march that will take place at Hilton Head High School starting at 10 a.m. And then in Bluffton, they're going to be holding their 5th annual Black Excellence Ball. The culinary experience, that'll be held at the Culinary Institute of the South, and that'll take place on January the 13th. And that's being put on hosted by the Bluffton's Dr. Martin Luther King Observance Committee. Also, I want to mention that here in just a few minutes, we'll be doing a ribbon cutting at the new Parkers off the Bluffton Parkway at 11 a.m. And so if you're out and about, and we would love to have you stop by the new Parkers for that ribbon cutting and support them as they open a new kitchen and gas station. So together, we wrapped up 2022, and I just put it out there to each of you that let's make 2023 a great year. Let's make it one of putting civil back into civility and putting kind back into mankind. And I think as we as a community can certainly do that together, and we will all be better for it. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to being with you next time. Have a great rest of your day, and let's make it a great year.